So if somebody comes along and says, well, at the basis of the universe there is God, and God exists by necessity, that is, God could not fail to exist. God is something to which there is no alternative. God has to be the way God is. I agree with all those statements, incidentally. And Hume is saying, well, look, I can imagine God, and I can imagine God not existing. And if I can imagine it, it could happen. Therefore, God can't be necessary. Okay? So the crucial move here is to say, whatever I can imagine can happen. A similar sort of argument is again about evil. I can imagine a universe without any evil in it, therefore God could have created one. Okay? So because I can imagine it, it could happen. So no necessary beings, and there doesn't have to be any evil. And again, this goes back to the roots of Hume's philosophy. Is what you can imagine going to be the test of what is real? And I want to make a big distinction, as in fact I've already done implicitly, between imagination, which is a form of picturing or a form of sense experience, and understanding. So these things are quite different. What you think you can imagine might be totally different from what is intellectually the case, which you could intellectually understand. And I think a fairly good example of this is the question which is dealt with by Robin Wilson in Gresham lectures quite recently. Can you find a square which is equal in size to a given circle? Now, I wonder how you decide that. Do you do it just by imagining? Okay, I'm not going to answer the question, can you find a square equal in area, exactly equal in area to a given circle? I'm just going to ask you, how would you go about deciding this? Well, Hume's method would be, well, you think of a circle, you imagine it, and then you imagine a square, and you imagine them having the same size. No problem. Yes. The answer is yes, because you can imagine it. So, and my point is, your imagination is a complete waste of time. I don't care what you think you can imagine. You have to know something about pi. You have to know something about how you find the area of a circle, and you have to know how you could translate that into the size of a square or a rectangle before you can intellectually answer the question. And, well, it might look as though it wouldn't be so easy, would it, really, to know that, because pi is an irrational number. It doesn't look as though it has any end. So intellectual understanding might give you a different answer from imagination. And that's the only point I want to make, which will save everybody going to sleep rather quickly. That is, you think you can imagine things, but perhaps unless you understood fully what was involved, you might be quite wrong in thinking you could imagine it. One other example I'll give you, again I won't give you the answer to it, I don't in fact know the answer to this one. Is time travel possible? Could you travel back in time? Well, use your imagination, and the answer seems to be obviously yes, because I've seen it in the cinema. So I've seen it, I can imagine it, I've seen it, so it's obviously possible. But could you really answer the question like that? Wouldn't you have to know a lot about the nature of time? Wouldn't you have to use your intellectual understanding? It's not just a matter of the old case of you go back and you murder your grandfather so you couldn't have existed, which is probably difficult. So people have to think of ways in which you never meet your grandfather in order to make time travel possible. But it's not just a question of that, it's a question of what would be involved in backwards causation, in going backwards in time. And that's such a difficult problem that I don't believe anybody has resolved it. So we might come to an answer, but you have to say, well, what's at stake here is not imagination, it's not picturing. In fact, let me be very dogmatic and say that probably if you're talking about the ultimate nature of space and time and the ultimate nature of the universe, anything you can picture is bound to be wrong. Right? That the universe is completely unpicturable. It is unimaginable. It's not only God who's unimaginable, but God is even more unimaginable than the universe. But even the universe is unimaginable. So if you say that, imagination is not a guide to the things that can exist. So Hume is wrong, then, in saying that whatever we can conceive, he means imagine, whatever we can imagine as existent, we can also conceive as non-existent. Let me just end this section by saying, if you think that God necessarily exists, what you're saying is, in every conceivable world, there is a God. There is no conceivable world without God. I don't mean imaginable now, that's Hume's interpretation. I mean intellectually, fully understandable. And that is not a self-contradictory statement. Just to say, it's certainly a possibility. It is possible that in every conceivable universe there is a God. That is, there is no universe without God if you understood it, if you understood what was involved in there being a universe. I think you have to say, well, that's a very difficult question, and it's not a matter of just what I think I can imagine. So that argument of Hume's that because we can imagine certain things they're possible seems a very bad one. And indeed, if I may put the knife in rather deeply, it contradicts his own principle, his principle that whatever we conceive as non-existent might not exist. That contradicts his principle that, and I quote, the ultimate springs and principles of nature are totally shut up from human curiosity. I.e., we don't know whether anything is necessary in nature at all. And to make it worse, Hume actually thought the laws of nature were actually necessary. And you remember he wrote a very bad chapter on miracles, one of the worst ever written in the history of philosophy, in which he said there couldn't be any miracles because the laws of nature necessarily operate. I ask you, how contradictory can you possibly get? So I want to reject completely Hume's principle that if you think you can imagine something, it could exist. That's the third point. The fourth one, still used by some people today. In fact, Richard Dawkins uses it in his book, the name of which I've forgotten. And in Hume's version, it is this: any God who created a complex universe like this would have to be at least as complex as the universe, and therefore would need explanation in the same way. And again, this is absolutely false, right? And the falsity can be demonstrated quite easily. The universe is complex. The universe is complex because it's made up of simpler parts, like atoms or quarks, which build up into complicated wholes. So the universe is made up of parts of things which could exist on their own, but they actually form together to form complex wholes. But God, by definition, is not made up of separate parts which are built up together to form one being. So God is not complex in the same way that the universe is. There is a sense in which God is complex. God contains the ideas of every possible universe there could ever be. God has knowledge of everything that exists. That's a certain sort of complexity. But nevertheless, God, as conceived by most philosophers, is a being with one consciousness, indivisible, and containing all possible information. So God is not composed of separate parts. And that's the traditional sense of saying God is simple. He's not composed of separate parts. So it's obviously false that God needs explaining in the same way that the universe does. What needs explaining about the universe is how you can get very complicated things like us coming out of simple atoms bumping into one another. That needs explaining, right? And there are ways of explaining that scientifically. But God doesn't need explaining like that. How could you explain God? Well, traditionally, the explanation for the existence of God is that God is a sort of being that is not causable, that could not be brought into being, that is, in other words, timeless. Now, again, this is a matter of intellectual understanding. It's not a matter of imagining. Intellectually, it is perfectly coherent to form the notion of something which is not in time. It's not temporal. In fact, all of mathematics is like that. It's not temporal. And if there is a timeless being, then it cannot logically be brought into being by anything. So it could not be explained by showing what brought it into being. Now, if you ask the question, what or who caused God, you haven't understood the idea of God, because the idea of God is of something timeless. If you can't frame that idea, think again, because it's perfectly easy to frame it. Right? A being, you just think of a temporal being, and then you think of a being which is not temporal. You just put the not in front. It's quite easy. So you can all conceive, though none of you can imagine, a non-temporal, timeless God. And then you are logically compelled to say nothing could possibly cause that God to be. No? It either is or it isn't. And if it is, it necessarily is. If it's not, it's necessarily not. But actually, there are lots of things around, so it probably necessarily is.